Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I ask Allah to bless and protect everyone participating in the seminar tonight, along with their families and communities. And I ask him to send peace and blessings on our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his family, and all of our pious predecessors. May Allah be pleased with them all. I'm honored to be joining you today from Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton. This is the traditional land of Indigenous peoples who have lived and passed through here for many centuries and continue to enrich our shared communities. And I open with that acknowledgement, not to pat myself on the back, but to remind us of the truths of our settler presence here, and in order to affirm my own commitment to honor the spirit of friendship in which the treaties were originally signed. And I also open with that because community care is the exact topic of my talk tonight, inshallah. As a community organizer and a researcher, as well as being a multiple trauma survivor myself, I've had a lot of experience with understanding and learning the importance of both giving and receiving community care. And my intention today is really to offer practical advice and ways for people to help out, to recognize their own personal capacity, first of all, to provide community care and to do so at the grassroots level. So I think we have all levels here today. We're talking about grassroots, we'll be talking about institutional leadership, and we're talking about some of the more important foundational philosophical concepts in terms of governing what we do. Of course, there's no greater time than now, I think, in recognizing the importance of what community care means. So before I begin with some practical considerations, I just want to talk about what community care actually is. It's primarily a commitment. It's a commitment to leveraging your privilege, your knowledge, your expertise. It could be leveraging your time and or your labor in order to be there for one another in multifaceted ways. It's important to recognize that this is a relational arrangement that's based on trust and reciprocity of giving and expecting to receive, even if that reciprocity is indirect. So the scale of community care can be between two people, it can be between a smaller group, it can be within a larger community, but the point is that you know and trust that as you contribute at a point of need, you might also be able to lean on the community in which you participate, inshallah. Community care is usually provided by individuals to benefit others around them. Of course, this, as I said, it can be scaled up to include neighborhood groups, community homes, support groups, and other nonprofits, which we'll talk about. But my goal today is really to show some of the acts on the interpersonal and individually political level that community care can look like in this current moment of crisis. Community care is like belonging to a committed, consistent extended family, and they're often obviously not necessarily your biological family, people that you've chosen to associate yourself with and to assist. At the core of community care is the adoption of an ethos of compassion, which governs all of our actions, something which is particularly powerful in anti-individualist communities, which if Muslim communities are not necessarily subscribing to, at least ought to be subscribing to. But before I get into the how of collectivist community care at a time of separation, let's first talk about its actual importance. So the first thing to recognize about community care is that it saves lives. And therefore it's a duty incumbent upon all of us as Muslims. It's many of the actions that you can take are simple and straightforward. They don't require a lot of time, labor, resources, or finances in order to save people's lives. And you don't necessarily, in the time of this pandemic, have to be a frontline worker to be saving people's lives. We know that the secondary quote unquote pandemic that's coming after COVID-19 or during this pandemic is a mental health crisis. And so we all have the ability to make room for life-saving techniques, which I'll talk about. Of course, this is because community care promotes mental wellness and physical wellness as well. It also mitigates social isolation, even in times of physical distancing. So even when we can't physically be together, community care offers us the ability to overcome social isolation, even if we can't physically be in the same room together. Related to kind of the holistic approach that Dr. Jasser was talking about, community care really helps us address systemic compounded inequities by sharing resources at the grassroots level and addressing unique individual barriers to assistance that might otherwise be overlooked by government or other agencies. It's important to note, however, that community care alone won't solve structural oppression, but it can lessen harm, and therefore it's something that must be undertaken. And it does help us develop pathways of resilience within community, which increase our overall group capacity to resist systems of oppression. The other thing to note is that community care does not devalue self-care in any way. It only acknowledges that the two are actually inextricable. In a hyper-commodified society that tries to individualize and pre-package self-care in bubble baths and pedicures, subscribing to community care and caring for people outside of that commodification is really a radical concept, but it has to be balanced. People have to care for themselves as best that they can in order to be able to provide community care to others, but community care itself is also a facilitator of self-care. So they're mutually reinforcing systems of care based on the compassionate ethos. You know, for people listening, it might seem kind of like a no-brainer to be like, we all have to be compassionate and take care of each other. But one thing that I'm consistently surprised about is how often people underestimate their ability to make a difference in the lives of other people. And so this is hopefully will inspire people to recognize that the change actually starts with them. And not only that, but even if people recognize that they have the ability to make a difference, they don't always know where to start. So a lot of my work as a community organizer has been in doing research-based solutions for people to have action items, particularly in moments of crisis. Obviously, you know, in regular non-pandemic times, community care looks a lot different than it's going to look today. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. I want to stress, of course, also that staying at home at this point is actually a radical act of community care and something that is a duty for all of us. So let's not underestimate the impact of actually staying at home as being representative of our compassionate ethos. But within this context, there are three main areas that are practical for people to focus on if they're looking for somewhere to help. These areas are in mental health, including domestic violence, hunger, and financial support. So I'll just quickly go into a few tips. And of course, these are you know, these are some of the tips that I'm going to give are things, they're more like a to-do list for you to look into more. I'm not going to be able to go into full depth. When it comes to mental health, one of the most important things that people can learn how to do is hold space for other people. That means that we recognize that when someone comes to us to confide in us or to speak to us about something that's troubling them or something that they're struggling with, particularly in these troubling times, that we're able to listen deeply, that we don't necessarily approach with a problem-solving attitude, even though we might be doing that internally. We're there just to hold space for them and validate what they're going through. And that means that we have to approach with an ethos that is judgment-free, and we have to let people come as they are. I think a common misconception with holding space that people have is that if you're validating somebody's struggle and their experience, it means you're condoning what they're doing, and that's not actually the case. We have people who have issues of substance abuse or anything along those lines, or alcoholism that might come to you, and it's not really the time to be sitting with them talking about halal and haram. It's to be approached as a red flag, something that folks need assistance with, and they need some help with, and they're coming to you as somebody that they can trust. And it's important in holding space for them to help them recognize that they're not a burden in asking you, and to continuously check in with yourself while you're holding space for them, that you have the mental bandwidth to assist them. On that note, you know, holding space is kind of the second step. The first step is doing check-ins with people regularly. That means just shooting somebody a text or giving them a call, even an email. I have people who don't have access to phone lines overseas that I'll send an email. And or a private message or something like that, you know, and basically you're just not waiting for people to reach out to you, which can be really hard to do for people while they're struggling or in moments of a crisis. At the same time, in order to reach out, to know who to reach out to, you can also be looking for signs of distress in people's social media statuses, or even in their silence. If there's somebody that you know that's been particularly active online or who regularly calls you that suddenly dropped off, it's really a great opportunity for you to just say, hey, how's it going? How's your day been? Is there anything I can do for you? That sort of thing. Keep in mind too that checking in with somebody and holding space for them, it doesn't have to be deep. A lot of people will be like, well, I'm not a therapist, I can't really do this. It doesn't have to be a deep conversation about everybody's childhood trauma, although it can get to that point, of course, where you're offering support. But a lot of people just want to talk about life and talk about what movies they watched. And because social isolation has such a detrimental effect, those simple check-ins where people are talking about their day and whatnot can be really powerful and meaningful. These are also important when it comes to addressing domestic violence during the pandemic. Of course, we know from researchers and we know in the current media that you know, the pandemic and social isolation along with it is really a powder keg for domestic violence. It allows abusers to have greater control over their victims, and isolation also makes warning signs of abuse harder for people to spot. So we don't have teachers on the front lines looking at what's going on with their students. We don't have doctors, you know, doing physical examinations and seeing, you know, signs of abuse on people's bodies, this sort of thing. So of course, keeping in touch, again, keeping in touch with people is a really great way to address domestic violence during the pandemic, so that if they feel that they need to confide in somebody that something negative is happening to them chronically in their home, that they'll be able to come to you because you've always been there for them. So believing your power, your ability to do that. Of course, believe in them, believe them when they confide in you. You're not a judge or a jury, and you don't need to be at that particular junction. You know, studies have shown that people who confide in others about abusive situations, when they're stated that the person that they've confided in believes them, they're at much less risk, not only for staying in an abusive situation, but also surviving death by suicide. Of course, respect their confidentiality and just be consistent in keeping up with them. Help them grasp that they deserve better treatment, and also, especially in this time of social isolation, that they're not trapped. If somebody needs to get out of an abusive situation, you know, you can acquaint yourself with trustworthy resources and referrals to organizations and community that help people escape those situations. Just because we are to stay at home doesn't mean we have to stay in abusive homes. So I think that is really important, and some easy tips for mental health and domestic violence. The other issue that was already touched on by our first speaker is hunger. Of course, an easy way to address this is to donate to local food banks or services for folks who are providing for targeted individuals who do not have enough to eat. But you can also do something as simple as checking on your neighbors. You can leave a note in their mailbox or give them a call if you have their number, and just let them know, hey, I'm placing a grocery order, or I'm going to do a grocery run. Is there anything extra that I can pick up for you? Of course, Another way that we can all contribute, again, this was touched on, so I won't go too much into it, but we don't need to overconsume in this time. And even though people might have an inclination out of anxiety and fear to hoard, that's not what we're taught in terms of our guidance. And it actually has a detrimental effect because when people are buying up all of the bulk cheap items, it means that people who have less money have to purchase more expensive items in smaller quantities. And they're more at risk because they have to be in the grocery stores more continually, and then people's houses are just full of food that could be feeding other people. The other way, part of the way to address hunger within a community care ethos is also with spring and summer coming, think about planting a garden if you have a garden space, or joining a community garden, many of which are not being closed in lockdowns because the amount of people patroning them are minimal. Of course, financial support is really important during this time. You should be fulfilling your commitments as best you can that you already have. Try your best not to break established contracts with people who may be relying on those funds to feed their families. You can help people pay their bills. Something as simple as I regularly post to social media. Is anybody struggling financially right now? Does somebody need money for groceries? And I'll get an inbox full of DMs. And it doesn't mean that I have to necessarily pay those bills, but I might know people who I can allocate funds from and divert them to people who are in need. More common bureaucratic community sources. If you're a landlord, waive your rent at this point. And if you're getting deliveries to your house, definitely tip your drivers and your personal shoppers because most of them are not making a livable wage per hour and are putting themselves on the front lines in grocery stores to purchase your items for you. All of these areas, before I conclude, all of these areas have advocacy and activist aspects to them beyond person-to-person action items that I've already mentioned. And related to that, everybody from inside their house can be writing to and calling all levels of government to ensure that tighter lockdowns are brought in so that we can protect our most targeted individuals. For worker protections, we can be advocating with our voice from home. We can be advocating for rent freezes and mortgage suspensions, as well as housing for homeless folks who are most at risk of infection. And of course, putting our money where our mouth is and advocating for accessible, funded healthcare, not only during the pandemic, but afterwards with our votes in the next election. So these are some really important things to consider, some very practical steps that you can take to cultivating community care and including practices of it in your everyday life during this time of crisis. I'll leave you with, one final thought, which is that, of course, a reminder, when people confide in you or when you check in with them, please maintain confidentiality with them. Don't go telling people other people's business, of course. Respect that your privilege and your understanding and biases might not necessarily be the same as somebody else's worldview and experiences. And recognize also the impact of your words, both negatively and positively. People are dealing with a lot of collective grief on top of their existing problems. And so be very mindful of not only not being harsh with people, but going out of your way to be extra kind, because you never know how that can actually impact somebody's day. So thank you so much again for the opportunity to speak and offer some insights from my practical experience in cultivating community care and offering it. And I'm looking forward to some questions, inshallah. Barakallahu feekum.